Taoiseach, after yesterday's ballot results from SIPTU in relation to the Croke Park II agreement, it's now very clear that this agreement has been rejected by the membership of the trade unions across the country. And clearly, union members were not persuaded by the government. Many never believed in the first instance that this was a fair deal, but clearly they weren't persuaded by the government. And indeed, we have been pointing out and putting down markers to the government in relation to the strategy it adopted, and also the disproportionate attack and unfairness of the deal in relation to frontline workers in particular, and for some reason health sector workers seem to have been sidelined and shafted from the very, very beginning, and indeed workers in the justice arena as well. And I would put it to you, Taoiseach, that the government's strategy, which was essentially a mixture of divide and conquer, putting unions against unions, a little bit of bribery at the end with a 300 million honeypot to do a whole range of side deals with various unions, the details of which have never been publicised. And finally then, when the soundings were somewhat negative towards the end, basic intimidation and threats that, if you don't vote yes here, we're going to go ahead with legislation anyway to do across-the-board 7% cut. And I think the mixture and combination of that strategy was clearly wrong and misfired significantly, and union members didn't take to the threats that well at all. And the result is a rejection of the deal itself. And I think a message has been sent to the government by the public sector workers. And what I want to ask the Taoiseach this morning, because notwithstanding the cynical sort of strategy that was deployed to try and get this deal over the line, and the approaching it more as a numbers game than any other alternative, could I ask you, Taoiseach, does the government have a plan B here? Because the minister, responsible Minister Howland, seemed to be shell-shocked on the 6-1 News last evening in his response to this deal. He was talking about getting phone calls and so on like that. For a lot of people on the ground, there wasn't surprise, actually, that this deal was going to go down. And the only surprise today is that the government ministers seem to have been surprised and taken back by the result. And could I ask you, Taoiseach, surely you must have factored in to your thinking a possibility that this deal was going to be rejected and that you would have a plan B in position? Or do we take it that if you don't, that the threats or the utterances and articulation by the Minister for Public Sector, Brendan Howland, that he would go ahead anyway, and indeed you said it yourself early on in this process that you would go ahead with legislation, that you never really meant that, and that's not now on the agenda. So could you outline to us, Taoiseach, what your plan B is in relation to the outcome of the vote on Croke Park II?
Thank you. Taoiseach. Taoiseach, without rumblings from the back.
Well, I'll outline the truth of the situation for you, Deputy Martin. Let me assure you and everybody else that the government is absolutely united behind the Minister for Public Expenditure in his declaration and in his negotiations that we need to find 300 million of extra savings from payroll this year and 1 billion by 2015. And there is absolute unity of purpose in government towards achieving that objective. Now, I recognise the result of the ballot yesterday. I'd point out to Deputy Martin that the mandate given by the government to Minister Howland was to open negotiations and discussions in a full, open, truthful and constructive fashion, and the LRC came forward with its proposals. These proposals were based on a fair and equitable contribution from the public sector, given that 35% of pensions and 35% of the pay bill comes from payroll and pensions. And that was done specifically to defend frontline services and also to keep a very clear view of the progress that the government have made with the people in terms of the path that we've been following towards recovery of our economic independence and towards achieving credibility internationally and growing our own economy so that we can provide jobs for our people. So government will now consider the outcome of the ballot, the consequences of the ballot, but let me say this again. The bottom line here is absolutely clear. We have to we must and we will find 300 million of extra savings this year from payroll, and that's the challenge that government now faces, and we'll obviously reflect on this. I'd point out to you in conclusion that your own spokesman last Sunday only equivocated about 60 million out of the 1 billion in savings between here and 2015. And when you had the opportunity yourselves, on 2 occasions, you imposed unilateral cuts without any discussion. At least the government entered a very open, consultative, truthful situation with the public sector and gave them the time and the space to make their decision in the proper fashion. They've made their decision. The arithmetic doesn't change. The bottom line doesn't change here. We need to find 300 million of extra savings this year from within payroll, and government are absolutely united behind the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform in achieving these, because it's necessary for our country, for the broader impact of the challenge that people have faced up to right across this country to clear up the mess that we inherited.
Thank you. Deputy Martin, 1 minute. Thank you.
First of all, Taoiseach, it's very clear that your plan B is to reflect. I find it extraordinary that there is no more detail emanating from you in relation to the scenarios that you must have factored in. Indeed, that Minister Howlett himself in the Irish Independent on April the 13th, when the news from the teacher unions wasn't coming too well, when he was talking about a 7% across the board. And I welcome the fact that the government is united. I welcome the fact that Fine Gael and the Labour Party are united on this issue, because some elements of the Labour Party have been speaking out of both sides of their mouth in relation to this particular issue. So that is welcome. It is welcome that that unity of purpose
resist the temptation,
is there.
please. Resist the temptation. Put your question.
But Taoiseach, what I want to put to you, Taoiseach, is that when you were asked here some weeks ago in the Dáil in relation to 3 elements of legislation that Minister Howlett committed to, and he said would be implemented, irrespective of a vote. Now, you were asked again yesterday in the House, will that legislation be coming forward in relation to aspects of this particular deal? And you equivocated on that and didn't give a straight answer. And finally, I want to put to you, Taoiseach, when you talk about transparency and so on, bottom line is our spokesperson on this issue has been seeking for the last number of weeks just full transparency in the 300 million of side deals that were negotiated with different unions to sweeten the deal after the LRC package had been announced, with a view to trying to get the numbers over the line. We saw this on the frontline workers
this is question
and
time,
so on,
please,
and we have no idea of what kind of nods and winks were sent in different directions to try and get the votes over the line.
Thank you.
You played an old-fashioned traditionalist numbers game.
We cut out the
over the line, and it failed spectacularly. And it was a combination.
Deputy, I have to ask you to resume your seat, please.
A bit of bribery and a bit of intimidation at the end, and it misfired spectacularly.
Thank you. I remind people that this is leaders' questions, not statements. Thank you. Taoiseach.
If you have passed through some Damascus down there in Cork, because what you did when you had the opportunity and had responsibility to be truthful and open with the people of this country, you denied the people access to any letters of clarification issued by your own governments. You shredded all the information insofar as benchmarking was concerned many years ago. And unlike the situation that Minister Howlett has set out here, he published the clarifying letters for those unions and their representatives that stayed in at the talks in respect of frontline services like firefighters and prison officers and members of the defence forces. I would have thought, Deputy Martin, I would have thought that from somebody of your experience that you would at least allow the opportunity for the LRC to announce formally the result of the ballot that was taken here. And that's the very least that you would expect from you. You don't even seem to recognise that. Now, government has set out the position here, and the position is absolutely clear, Deputy Martin. In this country, its people, everybody, has faced up to difficulties over the past number of years because of what was left behind, the wreckage left behind by yourselves. Now, we have recovered to a great extent, our international economy in terms of credibility and reputation, and everybody has contributed to that. We've got a challenge here now in getting 300 million extra of savings from within payroll this year and $1 billion by 2015. That's the challenge and the issue that the government now have to face. And that's an issue that we will deal with from within that payroll. And as I said, government are absolutely united with the Minister for Public Expenditure here in declaring the truth of this matter. Because all of those people who voted, some voted for and some voted against, you recognise this.
Thank you.
The party on your right-hand side have a different view, and as I said, before the last budget, they put forward a proposition of $3 billion of extra taxes, which have delivered a lethal injection to the Irish economy, driving thousands and thousands of jobs out of the country. What we have to do is follow a credible fiscal plan to retrieve our economic independence, to restore our public finances to good health, to continue to make changes that bring about greater efficiency and greater effect for frontline services. And these discussions, which were fair, which were equitable, which brought about a contribution from the public sector, which is necessary as part of the overall sector to deliver 300 million extra savings this year and $1 billion by 2015, is in the interest of the Irish people and the Irish country in general in terms of its reputation, and government will now sit down over the next period and deal with that particular issue.
Could I ask deputies, please, the purpose of leaders' questions is for the leaders in opposition to ask a serious question in relation to a serious matter, and for the Taoiseach to reply. Now, there are people in the gallery who would like to hear the reply, and they'd like to hear the question, and there are people watching on television who would like to hear the reply. And all this mumbling and smart aleck remarks out there are not impressing anybody, so would you give people a chance to listen to them? It's a very important issue, and people want to hear what the answer is. Thank you. Deputy MacDonald, thank you.
Taoiseach, yesterday public sector workers dealt a body blow to your austerity agenda, with an overwhelming majority of unions saying no to Croke Park II. The truth of this matter is that the workers correctly calculated that this was an unfair deal. They recognised that it would be bad for public sector workers and their families, bad for the public services on which we all depend, and of course bad for the domestic economy. Our nurses, our teachers, our emergency service workers refuse to be intimidated by Minister Howland's bully boy threats. And they've now sent you a very clear signal, Taoiseach. They're telling you that you've taken enough from them and they don't have any more to give. Can I say that the idea that you would suck $1 billion out of public services and not hurt the schools that educate our children or the hospitals that care for our sick family members was always absurd. Equally absurd is Minister Howland's claim that he will run out of money before the end of the year. Anyone with the wit to read the NTMA's exchequer balance figures knows that that is simply not true. Taoiseach, everyone knows that we have to address the deficit, but your approach is unfair and unworkable, and there are alternatives, Taoiseach. If you're so concerned about making payroll savings, well, tackle the issue of excessive pay at the top of the public and civil service. Get a real deal on generic drugs, or why not a third tax rate on individual incomes over €100,000, because these alternatives would raise the revenue you say you require to meet your Troika target. So, Taoiseach, will you respect, never mind reflecting or considering, will you respect the outcome of the union's vote on Croke Park II? Will you now withdraw your threat of an across-the-board cut of 7%? And finally, Taoiseach, will you go back to the drawing board and look at the alternatives to raise the revenues you say you require, and come back with a deal that's fair? Fair to workers, fair to families, and fair to the domestic economy.
Thank you. Taoiseach.
Well, what you propose again is complete and utter hypocrisy from what you put forward just a short time ago, of 3 billion of extra cuts in income tax, which would, as I said, be a lethal injection for the economy of this country, which would drive thousands and thousands of jobs out of our country. The Sinn Féin proposition for the economic development of this country is simply and utterly catastrophic. Now, 87% of public sector workers had their pay absolutely protected under the negotiations that were conducted here. And you'll be aware, Deputy MacDonald, that 5% of income earners, that the top 5% of income earners pay 44% of tax at the moment. You asked a question from the Minister for Public Expenditure in February with your analysis that if everybody was capped at 100,000 to include local authorities and state agencies, what the outcome would be. The estimated net savings would be less than 110 million, which would give a marginal tax rate for a public servant of 100,000 per annum or higher is at least 62.5%. Now, you were asked last night, what were your alternatives? Well, you said you'd put on your thinking cap and that a 48% tax would bring in 300 million. I think you need to get a lot more thinking caps in that party, because what you are proposing would be the ruination of this country, the ruination of it. So government, as I said to Deputy Martin, will now consider the outcome of the ballot as announced by the LRC. We consider the truth of the bottom line expressed repeatedly by government and particularly by Minister Howland, whom we absolutely support in this, of achieving 300 million of extra savings from within payroll this year, amounting to 1 billion by 2015. That's absolutely necessary for the economic salvation and development of our country as we retrieve our economic sovereignty and as we go forward to improve public finances, to run the systems efficiently and to provide jobs for our people, and to protect and develop the very frontline services that you speak of, in respect of which we're borrowing in excess of €1 billion every month at the moment.
Thank you. Deputy MacDonald, 1 minute.
Well, Taoiseach, can I politely suggest to you that for the 426,000 people on the live register and the 1,600 people who emigrate every week, it is you and your administration that are delivering the so-called lethal injection. You've really showed your hand there in your response, because, you see, you won't countenance levying the burden on those that have more. You just won't do it. You won't look at the high earners in the public sector or the private sector. You just won't do it.
Sorry, please.
And Taoiseach, can I say to you, if you thought, or your colleagues thought for 1 second that middle and low-income workers in the public sector were a soft touch for your lethal injection, you got it very, very wrong.
Question, please.
Now, I suggest that you put on your thinking cap. That was my point last night, and I'm glad that you were tuned in. You're clearly adverse to any sort of thinking outside of the box. You need to find 300 million. We've given you concrete examples of where those monies can be raised. Go and find it.
Thank you.
But back off public sector workers who struggle to heat their homes and to pay their bills. That's the reality of what you have delivered so far. And could you please answer my questions? Are you going to back off the threat of the 7% cut across the board?
Deputy, would you please put your question?
Or no? Are you really going to respect the democratic verdict of the unions and their workers? Yes or no? Those are pretty clear-cut questions.
Thank you.
Which
Thank you. Even
you, Taoiseach, should be able to answer.
Taoiseach.
Well, as I said to you already, the government have a very clear fiscal programme set out here. That requires us to achieve 300 million of extra savings from within payroll this year in 2013, amounting to 1 billion extra payroll savings by 2015. That's what the government have to deal with now, and the government will obviously consider the outcome of the ballot, and the government will make its decisions as to how those 300 million of extra savings can be achieved. The government's door is always open and has always been open to unions and their representatives to make their views known, and that was very extensive, very fulsome and very truthful in the discussions and the negotiations that took place under the direction of Minister Howland with the LRC and the trades unions. I'd repeat for you again, Deputy MacDonald, 87%, the overwhelming majority of public servants had their pay untouched by the proposals on the table. And for your information, and you're aware of this, but you won't say it. You won't recognise it. You won't recognise it.
Deputy MacDonald, you're the very one who demands silence when you're speaking. Would you allow a reply, please, now, without interruption?
As I said, 87% of public sector workers had their core salaries and core pay protected under the negotiations and the LRC proposals. And it's perfectly obvious that when you say, in your vision for the new Ireland, to tax those on higher levels out of existence, the Association of Higher Civil Servants voted overwhelmingly against this proposal simply because they were targeted by government for bigger contributions from higher salaries. So it is blatantly untrue for you to say that there is no focus and has been no focus on those who earn most to pay most. And as I said to you, the marginal rate with the marginal tax rate and the pension rate reduction for a person on over 100,000 now is 62.5%. What you want to do is simply tax people out of existence with some vision of yours that that's going to sort out all our problems.
Thank you, Taoiseach.
The challenge now, Deputy MacDonald, is to achieve 300 million extra savings this year, and let me reassure you there's absolute unity of government in this matter and unity of purpose in government in achieving those extra savings.
Thank you.